Yolotsiag is a mountain located in the northwestern part of the Ural Mountains in Russia. The name, translated from Mansi, means Mountain of Thee. This is related to an ancient legend that says 9 Mansi hunters got lost in the forest near the mountain and were found dead days later. Its dark aura grew much stronger long after, when the place became the last campsite of the members of the Dyatlov expedition, before perishing and giving rise to one of the modern mysteries that has generated the most enthusiasts. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Some events become eternal mysteries because of their unique traits. Sometimes it's because they happened at a particular moment because they happened right then, in the least likely place, or because people who seem to be hiding something were involved. This case meets all those conditions and many others. As time went by, in fact, the questions and hypotheses, instead of decreasing, only grew. They blamed the harsh weather, mythological creatures, other people, infrasound, the KGB, hallucinogenic fungi, criminals, poisoning, a fierce internal dispute, and even the extraterrestrials. There are evidence that could support these theories. The only thing that is clear is that in 1959 something truly unusual happened in Russia. In fact, for many decades, the official verdict was that the victims had died due to physical injuries caused by an unknown and overwhelming force. What really happened in that distant and misty February? What did the investigators' documents mean by an unknown and overwhelming force? What did the Russian government say when it reopened the case in 2019? Did you know that the body of one of the deceased hikers was exhumed at the explicit request of their family? What contradictions did the members of the rescue group get into? What suspicious thing did a group of witnesses see a few kilometers away from where everything happened? All around that same time, were more bodies actually found than we think? We're probably dealing with one of those cases that leaves no one indifferent. That's why, if you're willing to give your own verdict about what happened, I invite you to join us for this special about the Dyatlov incident. Before we continue, I want to clarify that there is already a report about this case on this channel. That one is a few years old, and we decided it was time to update it with expanded information and details that weren't included in that first version. Also, if you're interested in these specials where we analyze classic cases in depth, you can comment by writing specials. Bundle up! Learning the details of this mystery will take us to a place with below zero temperatures. Let's begin. The dead from the Dyatlov Pass were not just ordinary hikers. They weren't clueless tourists or amateurs who underestimated nature. They were young, brilliant technical experts and students, sons of the new Soviet Union. Men and women forged in discipline, rigor, and a passion for conquering the extreme. It started in late January 1959. These 10 students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute set out north with the goal of completing a highly demanding journey. What? They wanted to take on the wild terrain, the harsh weather, and prove they were worthy of carrying, with a level 3 distinction, the highest sports category offered by the state they were part of. Optimism was the greatest asset of those boys and girls, but neither optimism nor the bravery they showed could stand against the inevitable. A brutal death that awaited them calmly, where optimism least expected it. Let's first get to know the leader of the group, whose last name would reach our days because of the tragic fate of his expedition.
Here he is!
Igor Dyatlov, born on January 13, 1936 in the Soviet Union, Igor Dyatlov was much more than just a dedicated student or a mountaineering enthusiast. He studied at the 5th Faculty of Radio Engineering at the Ural Polytechnic Institute. He had a brilliant and curious mind. Already in his second year, he had designed and assembled a working radio that was used during the 1956 expeditions in the Siam Mountains. That a boy had made it with his own hands was simply amazing, and that wasn't his only creation. He also came up with a small portable stove, a device that ended up being an essential part of his later trips. Even on his last expedition in 1959, Dyatlov took that same stove with him. But his connection with the mountain hadn't been forged at the university. He was still just a teenager who had just finished 7th grade. He was already going on excursions with his brother Vyacheslav, also a student at Ural Polytechnic Institute, on trips shared with more experienced mountaineers. From his start at Ural Polytechnic Institute, Igor eagerly embraced the adventurous life. He was meticulous, physically resilient, and had a balanced and calm character. His attitude was warm, respectful, and he was always willing to cooperate. He did not show arrogance, but he did have an ironclad firmness. He stood out for his ability to tackle any task with efficiency, good sense, and often an uncommon creativity. As if that weren't enough, he also had a good eye behind the camera. He was a dedicated, meticulous, and sensitive photographer. Many recalled an anecdote reflecting his character. During a walk, one participant gave in to a craving. Tempted by a can of condensed milk he kept in his backpack, he ate it in secret from the group. Regret later made him confess to Igor, who stayed silent, showing neither anger nor shame. He then urged him to put the cost of the condensed milk in the group's common box when they returned. Someone else might have delivered an indignant speech or imposed harsh punishments, but Igor was different. That mature, composed gesture was forever engraved in the memory of those with him. The young man often said the mountains called him and felt they were his true place and vocation. In John Muir's words, when the mountain called Igor Dyatlov, he had no choice. He went with determination. He was brave, confident, and experienced, but most importantly, a leader. Leadership isn't a skill you can learn. You can teach mountaineering, but you can't make people trust you with their lives. That's something you sense. Everyone felt it with Igor. Because of this, people said he had a bright future and was destined for great things. No one, absolutely no one, imagined that his story would end at 23 years old for what would be his greatest challenge. The young man had gathered a more than capable group, a group that, of course, was unable to imagine his terrible end. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, had an imposing build and studied radio engineering like many of his companions. His reputation preceded him. It was said that on one occasion he had survived a fight with a bear. Literally brave, reckless to the point of foolhardiness, impulsive like few others, Doroshenko had that kind of courage that can't be measured or controlled. He never backed down, even when the world challenged him. His intense spirit contrasted sharply with the Ural's icy demeanor. His bond with Sina, another hiker, was a silent story woven in the camp's shadows, where glances spoke louder than words. Sinaida, also known as Gorova or Sina, was 22 and studying radio engineering like Gorova. She was strong, determined, always with a smile on her face. Her colleagues valued her firm yet kind nature and her strength during tough times. She had a special bond with Doroshenko. It was unclear if it was affection, restrained love, or a bond formed in the mountains. The nature of their relationship remained speculative. No one doubted that Sina and Doroshenko understood each other beyond the obvious. Lyudmila Dubinina, only 20, was among the group's youngest and studied industrial economics of construction. Her presence was subtle yet strong, with rare composure for her age. On a previous expedition, an accidental shot wounded her leg, yet she continued the journey. She never complained or sought compassion. She was tough, smart, and critical of the Soviet system, which was rare and even more dangerous then. Her notes in the personal diary she took on her last trip raise questions that still have no answers. What was going through her mind in the days leading up to the tragedy? Was it just youthful restlessness or perhaps a dark premonition? Some coincidences in her writings still send chills down the spines of those who read them. It's as if she knew that something bad was waiting for them. Rustem Slobodin, 23, was a mechanical engineering graduate in excellent shape and among the group's best-trained members. He was called sharp, ironic, and observant. His travel diary shows a man who understood the absurd, writing with clarity and dry humor. Yuri Krivoshnitchenko, 23, studied construction and hydraulic engineering. He was the group's playful soul, always cheerful, smiling, and ready with a joke. He always had his mandolin, often playing it under the snow as if nothing else mattered. Some witnesses remember him making jokes, even in the middle of storms. Nikolai Thibaut Brignoles, a 23-year-old civil construction engineering graduate, had a last name that set him apart. Great-grandson of a French engineer who had settled in the Urals in 1880. His heritage accompanied him both in his blood and in his bearing. Serious, diligent, quiet, but always attentive, he embodied that mix of technical rigor and discipline that defined future Soviet professionals. Alexander Kolevatov, 24, studied nuclear physics. There was something about his presence that set him slightly apart from the rest. He was reserved, elegant, even refined. Some said he didn't quite seem to fit in, but in practice he was efficient and precise. He was trustworthy and did his job without seeking attention. He was the silent cog in the group. Semyon Solotaryov was a veteran who later became a source of several controversies. He was about 37 or 38 and studied military engineering. He also worked as a guide and trek instructor with real extreme experience. He had fought in the Second World War and carried in his eyes something that none of the others had, a hard memory marked by death and survival. His presence provided security but also created distance. Some trusted him completely, others viewed him with some suspicion, but no one questioned his ability. Yuri Yudin, 21, was the only one who had to turn back due to illness. He was the only one who didn't make it to the end, the only one who came back. Another student, Nikolai Popov, was also supposed to join the team, but at the last moment he was dropped from the plans and the group was finally formed. The 10 hikers aimed to reach Mount Otorten, roughly 10 kilometers from Jolatsiag. The journey had been classified as the most difficult of its kind, but it wasn't the first time they had attempted it. They kept records, plans, and maps, aiming to document the trip with photos and a shared diary. And above all, to earn the distinction few achieved. It was both an expedition and an act of self-improvement. These young men saw themselves as the sons of a powerful homeland and wanted to prove that they could tame the wildest nature, wilderness. And at some point along the way, the mountain and other forces decided to answer them. On January 23, 1959, the group set out from Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, heading for the northern Urals. It was winter, a Soviet winter like few others, with leaden skies, roads hardened by ice, and a dampness that never stopped seeping into your bones. The train moved slowly between small stations and quiet villages, carrying backpacks of supplies, cameras, unused film, notebooks, maps, a radio, and the mandolin, which more than once would lighten the tense air during the walks. The hikers were young but not naive. They knew what they were facing, and yet they still looked forward to it with a certain joy. They documented every stretch with discipline from the start. The surviving photos prove it. Laughter by a frozen river, gazes lost in endless forests, and improvised campfires near the blizzard's edge. A travel diary began to be the link between them, with phrases that mixed irony, enthusiasm, and a certain solemnity for the feat they were undertaking. On paper, they seemed invincible, and in the images, indestructible. The group arrived by train in Ibtel, a city in central Oblast, Esbertlovsk, on January 25th. Next, a truck offered to take them to Bishay, the last inhabited settlement in the far north. There, they greeted some lumberjacks, bought supplies, and sent postcards. On January 27th, they began the journey. Real, they left behind the traces of humans and ventured into the wild terrain, following the Lozba River to its fork, where the forest became denser and the snow more treacherous. It was then that fate showed its first warning. As mentioned, Yuri Yudin, the only group member with health issues, experienced sharp pain in his back and left leg. The rheumatism, heavy backpack, and extreme cold became unbearable. With regret, and probably with embarrassment, he decided to return. He said goodbye to Abraham with firm hugs, promises to meet again, and a look he didn't know would be the last. The photographs taken that day show him smiling, but with a strange shadow in his eyes. He was the only one who didn't complete the journey. Death had given him a truce. He didn't know it yet, but later he would carry the pain of the survivor. Before passing away on April 27, 2013, Yuri Yudin stated, and I quote, "If I had the chance to ask God a single question, it would be, what really happened to my friends the night everything ended for them?" What happened can only be pieced together from what's left. The rolls found in the snow, the notes from the collective diary, and some scattered footprints on the slope. On January 31, the hikers set up camp in the Ospila River Valley. The next day, they began the ascent to the pass that would take them to Mount Otorten. But the weather changed. The fog descended like a curtain that kept them from recognizing the landscape before them. And the wind picked up, creating shifting scenes that soon disoriented them and made them fall into a vile trap. Amid the confusion, the group took the wrong route. Instead of going around the mountain, as planned, they began to climb the slope of Jolatsiag, the mountain of the dead. As evening fell on February 1st, they stopped due to little progress and worsening conditions. They set up the tent in an exposed area, right on the slope, with no forest around. Some think they did it to keep their altitude, while others believe they wanted to test themselves by enduring the route's most inhospitable point. A third version says that the group simply did what they could. What almost everyone agrees on is that it was perhaps a hasty decision. Sure, they expected to spend the night and continue the next day. They were facing yet another difficulty, one they could have anticipated. What happened next? If we knew, this report wouldn't exist. That's how our story goes back to the beginning. Days went by. In Dyatlov, where the journey had begun, the family started to grow uneasy. The group was to send a telegram confirming their return on February 12th, but it never arrived. Initially, the authorities reacted with bureaucratic calm. They said that expeditions were sometimes delayed, that there was no point in getting alarmed. Was there any logic in those words? After all, it was true that storms, blocked roads, and communication failures could delay any hiker, even the young ones. Time went on, and with it, anxiety turned into fear. It was the families themselves who pushed for a formal search to begin. Parents, siblings, and university classmates raised their voices. On February 20th, rescue teams were finally organized. Students, volunteers, military personnel, dogs, trackers, and reconnaissance helicopter pilots all participated in the operation. For almost a week, they found nothing. Some subgroups even had their own difficulties getting back to the established paths. Until on February 26th, the search group spotted from the top of a snowy hill something that shouldn't have been there. A tent partially buried on the slope of Jolatsiag. It was the Dyatlov group's tent. When the rescuers got closer, what they saw defied all logic. The tent was torn not from the outside as if snow or wind had ripped it, but from the inside. The knife slashes in the canvas revealed a brutal urgency. Backpacks, coats, and boots remained inside the tent. Everything you would never leave behind if you decided to go out voluntarily in the middle of a polar night. The rescuers would also see other things, but we'll come back to those details later. For now, you should know that just meters away toward the forest, they found the first footprints. They were human footprints, barefoot or in socks, softly imprinted on the frozen snow. Following the trail, rescuers went to the forest edge, about 1,500 meters below. Under a large cedar blackened by fire remains lay the first two bodies, Yuri Krivoshnichenko and Yuri Doroshenko. They were barefoot, in their underwear, their toes blackened by the cold, their faces swollen, their bodies covered in scratches, as if they had desperately tried to climb the branches before collapsing. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin's bodies were found between the campsite and the forest. One about 300 meters from the tent, another 480 meters, another 630 meters. All in positions that suggested an attempt to return. Unlike the first two, the deceased in this group were better dressed, but still barefoot. Or is that what we're supposed to think? It's important to clarify that despite numerous videos and reports, fundamental contradictions have persisted for decades. And even the reports considered official were rewritten depending on who volunteered as a witness. On top of that, according to some, there were reasons to suspect that certain people were manipulating the information. All of this would obviously turn into a media bombshell, especially when the other bodies were found. In fact, what happened with the other bodies is what would trigger the most lurid speculations. The search for the other four expedition members lasted for more than 2 months. They were finally found on May 4th under 4 meters of snow in the stream of a ravine. Inside the forest and near an improvised shelter, about 75 meters from the tree where the first two hikers were found, Lyudmila Dubinina was found kneeling, her chest resting on the rock. Water was running over her face. Her eye sockets were empty and she had no tongue. Semyon Solotaryov was found in the ravine, also with empty eye sockets. The bodies of Alexander Kolobatov and Nikolai Tivox-Briknol were found together. The four of them were better dressed than the rest of their companions, even wearing some of their shoes. This detail is not minor. Many believe that this in fact is essential. If these last four hikers were wearing the clothes of the others, it means they had already found them dead and didn't want to end up like them. Does this make sense? The most interesting thing about this story is that everything does. When the forensic experts received the bodies of the Dyatlov group, they knew they weren't dealing with an ordinary case. The ice had preserved the bodies in an almost intact state, but what they found beneath that exterior shattered all expectations, even for doctors used to seeing the horrors of extreme cold. In addition to various abrasions on the face and arms, the forensic analysis highlighted a 6-centimeter fracture in the skull bone of Rustem Slobodin and a contusion on the side of Zenaida Kolmogorova, caused by blunt objects. In addition, the girl had fractured ribs, just like her companion Semyon Solotaryov. The other two showed head injuries, with Nikolai Tivox-Briknol being particularly severe. The forensic conclusions were death by multiple trauma, caused by undetermined reasons. And not just any kind of trauma, but one identical in force to that of a car crash. There were also other smaller but equally disturbing details. Some of the bodies had orange-colored skin, while others showed a slight purple hue. Witnesses of the examination said Dubinina's hair appeared to have turned gray. The state of decomposition was uneven. Some showed a rate of decomposition expected for the climate, while others seemed to have been preserved beyond what would be logical. And then, of course, there was the radiation. Tests on Dubinina and Solotaryov's clothing showed high beta radiation levels. These were not lethal levels, but they were abnormal. The report did not offer any conclusive explanation. Had they been in contact with contaminated material? Were they carrying radioactive material? Was there any outside exposure? Why were only some of them wearing contaminated clothing and not all? None of this made sense. Even though science couldn't explain what they were seeing, the case had to be closed. The matter had escalated to the press because of the way some of the victims' relatives kept protesting. Testimonies state that at that moment, men in civilian clothes, clearly connected to security groups, tried to silence those demanding the truth. A cover-up mechanism was forming, making everything more confusing and mysterious. The loss of many prominent young people always brings grief to a community. Similarly, failing to explain those young people's deaths can reveal leaders' ineffectiveness. No one wanted that to happen. The Soviet Union in 1959 was a tightly controlled and silent regime. A vast country aiming for space while rooted in its icy history. Nothing was allowed to tarnish its image, and no cracks could be permitted in the steel facade that the party projected to the world. That's why the official cause of death for 4 of the hikers was physical injuries caused by an unknown and overwhelming force. For the other 5, hypothermia due to exposure to extreme conditions. No culprit, no crime, no trial. In the following months, the case was classified. The past was closed to the public for several years. The families received impersonal letters, and there were no tributes or ceremonies. It was clear that the Soviet government didn't want any more questions, just as it was clear that answers were scarce. But the mystery was already planted, and since then, the mountain served as a reminder. A place where logic dissolves, science retreats, and the unknown opens its jaws. In 1967, when Stalin's silence still covered the Soviet Union, Yuri Yarovoy, a writer and journalist from S-Bird Loves, published a highly enigmatic and challenging novel. What few people knew, at least at that time, was that this work of fiction was directly inspired by a real incident. One that he had not only heard about, but had actually been a part of. Yarovoy actively participated in searching for the Dyatlov group. He wasn't merely an observer, he aided the investigation and served as the official photographer early in the rescue expedition. He knew the details firsthand because he had been there. However, the novel couldn't tell everything he knew. Yarovoy was forced to stick to the official version, making sure not to reveal anything beyond the authorized facts. The result was a story tinged with romanticism, with an ending much more benign than reality. In his story, only the group leader died, an idealized fiction for a truth that the regime preferred to keep buried. For an entire season, there was a deliberate attempt to confuse the citizens so that they would believe things had happened according to that book. Some of Yarovoy's colleagues claimed that there were alternative versions of the manuscript, harsher, more faithful to what had really been found on the mountain. But those versions never arrived. They were rewritten, censored, or destroyed. With the author's death in the 1980s, the possibility of recovering his personal files, photographs, diaries, and drafts was also lost. Everything disappeared without a trace. After the Soviet bloc fell, inconsistencies emerged. In 1990, Sverdlovsk's regional press published hidden details of the tragedy for the first time. They were timid articles but significant. The truth, the one that had been pushed to the margins of oblivion, was beginning to slip back to the surface. It was in that new context that a Dyatlov Foundation was established in Yekaterinburg, with the support of the Ural State Technical University. Under the direction of Yuri, the foundation set out with a dual mission. On one hand, to pressure the Russian authorities to reopen the official investigation of the case. On the other hand, to keep the memory of the hikers alive. The Dyatlov Museum, born from that determination, now displays original documents from the expedition. At the same time, and thanks to digital media, a new push took shape in 2017. A group of enthusiasts of the case, including researchers, fans, curious people, experts, and skeptics, launched the Dyatlov Pass website, an active community that expanded to Facebook and specialized forums. There, the data can be openly accessed. Forensic reports, images taken shortly before the fateful night, theoretical discussions, reconstructions. Anyone can explore the mystery if they choose. Thanks to all these efforts, many theories about what might have really happened began to emerge. One of the first alternative explanations was quietly proposed by scientists connected to the Ministry of Defense. There was talk of infrasound, a rare meteorological phenomenon that occurs when the wind blows at high speed over the slope of certain mountains. It emits an inaudible frequency that impacts the nervous system, causing dizziness, nausea, disorientation, and panic attacks. This was proposed by the researcher Donnie Aker after visiting the area in person and interviewing specialists in atmospheric physics. According to this theory, the Jola-Dzieg Pass has the perfect shape to produce an uncommon acoustic phenomenon with low-frequency waves that are inaudible to the human ear, but lethal. If this happened that night, the young people could have entered a state of collective hysteria. Amid the chaos, they cut the tent from inside to escape without logic, shelter, or shoes. But this, although suggestive, does not explain the internal fractures, the torn-out tongue, or the levels of radiation. Although the infrasound theory is not given much consideration nowadays, the truth is that some people complement it with another theory just as curious. It turns out that an anomaly was recorded in Kholat Shakal, near the place where the tent was found. In 1959, this anomaly was called the Appendix Zone. Some geologists say this is typical of the Ural Fault system, and that it can give certain magnetic peculiarities to those coordinates, peculiarities capable of altering and affecting human behavior. Was it really just about unusual winds in such a unique area? Magnetic anomalies causing 9 people to lose composure. Did everyone just go mad? That's all? Many believe this explanation is flawed and too simple. On the other hand, the second explanation, which captured public attention, was rather convoluted and sinister. The location was near military test sites, where missiles and experimental weapons were reportedly used. There are suspicions of aerial explosions that, without leaving visible traces on the ground, could have caused shockwaves capable of causing internal injuries. And did the detected radiation levels support this idea? Chemical, radiological, or dispersal weapon tests have also been proposed. If the group, without knowing it, crossed paths with one of these secret tests, they could have been the victims of poisoning or an accidental attack. After surviving, they would have been eliminated to perpetuate the cover-up. Another possible scenario is the power struggle and the illegal use of military equipment, particularly helicopters, by high-ranking officers. Alexander Golitsky proposed this theory in September 2011. During the incident, the 21st Congress of the Communist Party was being held in Moscow, and the Ministries of the Interior and the Navy were operating under an enhanced service regime. This meant that it was strictly forbidden for any military equipment to leave its location, so any personnel training related to the removal of military material was cancelled. Also, soldiers and officers couldn't take vacations, and commanders were on duty around the clock. In this context, the officers, the military personnel, who maintained friendly relations with at least one of the high-ranking Moscow commanders would have left home to the valley of the Auspila River, something that would be corroborated in recovered reports. According to the author, these soldiers were seen breaking the rules, and that's why they would have been responsible for making Dyatlov and his group disappear. Lisa. In short, it was an ambush by men who wanted to hide their privileged situation. This theory is largely based on the fact that some of the bodies were found carrying cameras, which were not the ones seen by the last witnesses who came across them. This suggests that after killing them, the military took the cameras from the hikers out of fear that they might have photographed them using the helicopters. Then they would have left them with different cameras with rather ambiguous or blurry photos. Does this theory seem like something out of a spy movie to you? Is it because you haven't heard what the next theory proposes? In fact, it was some strange details about the hikers themselves that gave rise to a Cold War espionage story. Let's talk a bit more about Semyon, the oldest member of the group. This single man joined the group at the last minute. As mentioned, he was a veteran with years of experience, a fighter for the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, and had an enigmatic tattoo, Der Muasaya. To this day, the word remains untranslated in any known language, Der Muasaya. On the other hand, the archives of the Ural Polytechnic Institute revealed a remarkable detail about Alexander Kolebatov. Before joining Ural Polytechnic Institute's Department of Technical Physics, he worked in Moscow as a laboratory assistant at a top-secret scientific facility, an unnamed atomic institute known as Post Office Box 3394. In turn, Yuri Krivoshnichenko worked at a post office box. Most notably, the Mayak plant in Chelyabinsk 40, where in 1957 a massive nuclear disaster occurred, only surpassed in severity by Chernobyl. The researcher Alexei Rakitin is certain that this peculiar community did not arise by chance. Behind the biographies of Solotaryov, Kolebatov, and Krivoshnichenko, the menacing shadow of the KGB can be perceived. According to Rakitin, the real purpose of the ski trip, unknown to the other 7 members, was to deliver radioactive samples to a group of CIA agents and to photograph the spies. The latter would have been carried out under the guise of a simple camping trip on the Mountain of the Dead. The meeting was supposed to take place on February 1st, but something must have gone wrong, and the Americans would have realized that the trio was playing both sides. That's how a conflict broke out that would end with the torture and brutal massacre of everyone. While you take notes and evaluate, let me present another angle, one based on the idea that the hikers were actually mistaken for fugitives or caught by someone. A lot of human experimentation to create new kinds of weapons. In the West, for example, the drug lysergic acid diethylamide was used as a stimulant, and its effects were widely studied to be used as a method of torture. To awaken hidden powers of the mind or to create super soldiers. This is what the scientific literature from those years says about lysergic acid diethylamide. I quote, "The effects of lysergic acid diethylamide are felt between 30 and 90 minutes after ingestion. Pupils usually dilate, body temperature rises or falls." Large doses of lysergic acid diethylamide cause hallucinations. These sensations can cause panic. A person under the effects of lysergic acid diethylamide might go out the window to take a closer look at the Earth. Were similar drugs invented in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics? It can be assumed that one of the hikers took stimulants, or even that someone in the group was told to try a new drug in field conditions. We're talking about young people who wanted to be the best at what they did and who may have been tempted by someone to try laboratory drugs in their performance. The well-known pathologist involved in the Dyatlov case, Eduard Tumanov, promotes the theory that the excitement led the hikers to participate in drug trials. Observations are based exclusively on the autopsy reports and mainly on what is missing from them. Judging by the official autopsy records, the members of the Dyatlov group had injuries that were likely sustained 1 or 2 days before their deaths. These abrasions and bruises are typical of blunt force injuries, such as from a fist, branch, or other solid object. On the face and hands, there are blunt abrasions with bruises that turn green. So, is it true that the group fought, only it wasn't with the Mansi but among themselves? In this theory, the suspicion that there was a relationship among the group members beyond just professional or friendly becomes more significant. This could have sparked antipathy, jealousy, or things like that. It was also suggested that the group might have died accidentally from poisoning by the fumes of the stove that was lit inside the tent. At this point, anything seemed possible. But of course, beyond these theories, there were also some that were a bit more paranormal. The mystery of the Dyatlov Pass didn't end with the frozen bodies or with the forensic reports sealed by bureaucracy. Quite the opposite. The real abyss opened up on the margins of what was documented, in the oral accounts, in the notebooks that weren't archived, in the nervous glances of those who were close. But they never wanted to talk too much. While the group was missing, several military and civilian witnesses reported seeing unusual phenomena in the night sky. We're talking more specifically about lights, spheres, fire, flashes that didn't follow any astronomical logic or common explanations like meteors or the northern lights. It is believed that some members of the expedition managed to photograph them. A particularly disturbing account came from hikers just a few kilometers from the site at the time. This group reported seeing, between February 1st and 2nd, a series of luminous orbs floating in the sky, changing position erratically. They weren't flares or spotlights, they were something else. They moved silently with an intention that wasn't clear. When they learned about the tragedy days later, these witnesses couldn't help but make the connection. Decades later, declassified reports also mention unidentified aerial movements in the Ibdel region, home to restricted military facilities. Some researchers suggested these were R-12 missile tests or dispersal explosives. Aerial mines dropped by parachute are also mentioned. This could fit in our secret weapons section. Only that another group of people asked a different kind of question. What if those lights were actually evidence of unidentified flying object activity in the area? In a photograph recovered from Krivoshnichenko's film roll, there is a blurry, almost abstract image. A black background, a white flash, and a tilted angle. Some believe he tried to capture something crossing the sky. Others say it was just a coincidence, an accidental exposure. But the image exists. And like everything in this case, it seems like a clue. There was also talk about the Russian jetty and the possible removal of evidence that showed a huge snow cryptid. Some say that the traces of radiation corresponded to previous trips that members of the group had made precisely to places with those characteristics. Many educational institutions had secret laboratories in those years. Be that as it may, no one seemed to agree on anything, but the questions persisted, and in 2019 the case was officially reopened. For more than 60 years, the Dyatlov case lived between myth and a closed file. It was discussed in underground forums, whispered in academic circles, and studied in Western universities. One of modern history's greatest enigmas, the subject was officially frozen in Russia. Until in February 2019, the country's Attorney General almost unexpectedly announced that the case would be reopened. The decision seemed to arise from a double impulse. On one hand, ongoing public interest is fueled by documentaries, novels, film reenactments, and conspiracy theories on social media. On the other hand, an institutional need to restore a certain narrative authority. If the Dyatlov case had become an uncomfortable scar in Soviet history, maybe it was time to heal it with an updated and, above all, controlled official account. The forensic team spent months on the investigation, conducting new expeditions. Meteorological data, satellite images, and digital models of the terrain were collected about the events. They used simulators and interviewed snow physics and extreme condition behavior experts. It seemed like a serious, meticulous, and even ambitious reopening, but there was one condition. The team considered only natural causes. Hypotheses about military activity, unconventional encounters, or anomalies were excluded from the beginning. It was an investigation with strict limits, as if the truth was forced to fit the inexplicable. In July 2020, Deputy Prosecutor Andrei Kuryakov held a press conference. In front of the cameras, he presented the official conclusions. An avalanche was the most probable cause of the tragedy. According to his explanation, the group had dug a platform on the mountainside to set up their tent. That action, combined with a mix of weather conditions such as snow accumulation, unstable slope, and nighttime gusts, would have caused the collapse of a slab of snow that fell onto the tent, so panic would have done the rest. The hikers cut the tent from the inside, fled half naked into the forest, and in their attempt to survive, died from hypothermia or from injuries sustained during their escape. Everything fit, a logical, tidy scenario, but it was so neat it felt suspicious. And the reactions were immediate. For the victims' families, the conclusion was a disappointment. For independent investigators, it was a technical cover-up. And for public opinion, yet another sign that the Dyatlov case is neither investigated nor analyzed, but rather managed according to certain hidden interests. The main critical points were not clearly refuted. Let's analyze. First, the tent. Despite the supposed avalanche, it was still largely standing. Second, the footprints that were found showed no signs of dragging. Third, the internal fractures that were reported were incompatible with an avalanche. Fourth, the radiation remained unexplained. Also, no avalanche had ever been recorded in that part of the Yulaxiag, before or after 1959. And yet, the case was closed as final. The Russian justice system closed the case, and the state publicly expressed relief. For many, the reopening of the case was not a search for the truth, but rather a containment strategy. A clear attempt to reframe the mystery within the bounds of what is tolerable. If this was really the case, the authorities failed spectacularly. People didn't want any more lies. More gatherings and conclusion. On April 12, 2018, at the request of the relatives, the body of Semyon Solotaryov was exhumed at the Ivasniko Cemetery in Yekaterinburg for identification. The overlay done by an expert showed a perfect match. Was it him? However, a few months later, the first DNA test results released by Channel 1 Russia excluded any relation between the person lying in Solotaryov's grave and his supposed family tree. The scandal was total but timely. A third test showed that the DNA of the person buried under the name of Solotaryov matched that of his niece. For conspiracy theorists, this fact does not rule out the investigators' version, who suspect that Semyon is not the man buried, but that in his grave would be his brother Nikolai. According to archival documents, Nikolai Solotaryov collaborated with the Germans and disappeared without a trace during the war. Therefore, we still cannot consider this investigation concluded. In any case, what would this mean? That fake bodies were used to cover up the truth? Why? Why would they make the body of an alleged avalanche victim disappear? On the other hand, those who took part in the search for the hikers showed eagerness and inconsistencies in their stories from the very beginning. Many of them were silenced, but the testimonies that came to light mention details that are sometimes even contradictory depending on the narrator, as if each of the rescuers had witnessed a different scene. Maybe this is due to the trauma of the moment. Maybe seeing the bodies altered their perception of what happened. Doesn't that sound logical? On March 15th, 2019, Channel 1 Russia aired a program about the Dyatlov Pass expedition, with the participation of journalists, representatives of the prosecutor's office, and experts. The commotion arose when, for the first time, an archive photo was shown with a frozen body that does not correspond to any known member of Igor's group. This fueled an idea that has gained ground in recent years. There were more bodies recovered at the pass. Dyatlov, Mansi's military aliens, we don't know. What does seem to be a constant is the fact that the mystery deepens year after year. Will we ever get to its core? Or has it finally become the perfect mystery? The kind that can only remain unsolved and shows us that sometimes uncertainty is the only certainty. What doesn't the Dyatlov Pass say about our present? What about the narrative of the great powers nowadays? Isn't the death of some people hidden every day, while special attention is given to the death of others? Is that what the Dyatlov Pass is? Is it just a metaphor for our existence in this chaotic world? What do you think? What's your verdict? Maybe that's why this case keeps attracting us. Because what makes it more impactful, its real strength unknown and unsurpassable, is not the absence of answers, but the confirmation that comes from it. A confirmation that gives us goosebumps. Reality is always much more complex than we think, and we will never fully know what's happening around it. A time focused on others' deaths, is that what Dyatlov Pass is? Is it just a metaphor for our existence in this chaotic world? What do you think? What's your verdict? Maybe that's why this case still draws us in. Because what makes it more striking, its truly unknown and insurmountable force, is not the absence of answers, but the confirmation that comes from it. A confirmation that gives us goosebumps. Reality is always much more complex than we think, and we will never fully know what is happening around it.